Jamel Dean knows that he has been put on notice. That and more on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, and welcome into this Wednesday episode of Locked On Bucs, your daily podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank you for making Locked On Bucs your first listen review every single day. Don't forget you can subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can follow along on Twitter. I am James Yarcho at @JYarcho_Bucs, credentialed member of the media covering your Tampa Bay Buccaneers as deputy editor of SB Nation's BucsNation.com. Here with you every Monday through Friday, along with the everydayers. And for that, I want to share my appreciation for your continued support of the show. One of the ways you can support the show is become a Locked On Bucs insider. You're going to get news, rumors, updates, and general thoughts, plus one-on-one conversations with me via text message. No ads, no hashtags, no anything like that. Just legitimate one-on-one conversations with me through text messages. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs to become an insider today. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Go to FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. My breakdown of Tykee Smith is coming up in a little bit, but let's start with Jamel Dean speaking with the media after practice on Tuesday. And Jamel Dean spoke with reporters for the first time this offseason and had a few things to say, as did his coach, Todd Bowles. But Rick Stroud of the Tampa Bay Times asked Dean about his former Buccaneers and Auburn Tigers teammate Carlton Davis being traded and how he heard about it. Dean said, quote, "It caught me off guard because I wasn't even aware of all the stuff that was going on until I got a phone call and I looked on the news and stuff and it said that Carlton got traded. I was like, what? Oh, okay, that's like random. They always say it's a business, though." Dean went on to say, quote, "It's kind of a different feeling knowing I've been playing football with him for X amount of years than seeing him not out there is kind of different now that my buddy ain't here," end quote. That moment right there put Jamel Dean on notice that it can happen to anyone. And if your play or your availability isn't matching your contract, then you won't be around for very long. Subtly, that's also the message that Todd Bowles has given him. When Bowles was asked what he had said to Dean during OTAs, Bowles told reporters, quote, "He's got to stay healthy, number one. That's the biggest thing. When he's healthy and he's on the field, he's a great asset for us. To go from good to great, you first have got to be healthy. His message for camp is to master the defense and not worry about the offense. If he understands where his help is, he'll have a heck of a year," end quote. So what is Jamel Dean doing about it? Well, he told the media that he's been working on building up his strength in the muscles that he's, quote, probably been neglecting to try to avoid injuries caused by overcompensating. He's trying to be, as he put it, more balanced in terms of his body and his overall shape, that he's been working on his quads, hamstrings, and shoulders. Jamel Dean has yet to play a full season in his career and has missed at least 2 games every year. Last year, he missed 4, which was a career high. He also finished with a career low 4 passes defensed. He had his first season without an interception, although he dropped quite a few that should have been picked off, most notably in that divisional round game against the Detroit Lions. And he had 0 tackles for loss in the first time in his career. All of this happened after getting a 4-year, $52 million deal with $21.5 million guaranteed at signing. And the Bucs can get out from that contract after this season with just $6.85 million in dead cap if Dean does not get things on track. He accounts for $14.6 million against the cap this season and over $15 million against the cap in each of the next 2 years. If he doesn't want to be, somebody facing the same fate as his friend Carlton Davis, he knows that his game has to be taken up to another level, which is why he's also hyper-focused on making sure he doesn't drop those interceptions in 2024 the way that he did in 2023. He told reporters that he's catching 50 balls a day from the jugs machine and then also catches passes from the quarterbacks if he can to try and become more secure with his hands this upcoming season. Jamel Dean is certainly confident in the tandem with Zion McCollum this season, but you can start to see that he's putting in the extra work to be the guy on the defense. Davis was the guy, and Dean was his number 2 over the course of the last couple of years. Now, Dean has to step up and be the guy while McCollum is his number 2. There's a lot more pressure to perform, a lot more responsibility with this kind of promotion, and Dean knows that. I talked last week about how Jason Light isn't afraid to move on from contracts or draft picks or players if things aren't working out, and Jamel Dean knows that as well as anybody. So he's got to make sure that he doesn't give Jason Light or Todd Bowles a reason to move on from him, especially after the Bucs brought in 2 corners in free agency, drafted Tykee Smith, who we are going to talk about in just a moment. You guys know the motto that I've kind of been pounding this offseason. They are talking the talk, but they have to walk the walk. Dean is saying the right things, and he appears to be doing the right things in practice and in the weight room and trying to build up his physical attributes as well as his level of play, but it has to translate to the field. The Bucs are going to face some legitimate receivers this year, and Dean is going to be tasked with shutting them down. Amon-Ra St. Brown, A.J. Brown, Drake London, Chris Olave, the combo of Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel, Devontae Adams, CeeDee Lamb. These are not pushover wide receivers, and it's usually fallen on the shoulders of Carlton Davis to be the one to limit those guys. Now, Jamel Dean has that job, and he has to be ready to have his best season yet, or the Bucs will be in the market for a corner again next off season. Speaking of cornerbacks, my deep dive into Tykee Smith, that is coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, over-unders, parlays, player props, and so much more. You can bet on everything from slap shots to home runs and slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. The Boston Celtics are the favorites to win the NBA Finals after sweeping the Indiana Pacers in the Eastern Conference Finals, and they sit at minus 230, followed by the Dallas Mavericks, who are at plus 210. So everybody get ready for the Kyrie Irving storylines to go into overdrive. Meanwhile, in the race for Lord Stanley's Cup, the greatest trophy in all of sports, the Dallas Stars are the favorites at plus 150, followed by the New York Rangers at plus 200. The Edmonton Oilers are now sitting at plus 470, and then finally the Florida Panthers at plus 480. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Thank you again for making Locked On Bucs your first listen review every single day. Every day, make sure you are coming back tomorrow. Plenty more to react to from Todd Bowles following practice on Tuesday. But in the meantime, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every single day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news. Streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, so Tykee Smith, the Bucs' first of 2 third-round picks in the 2024 NFL Draft, and the guy that is expected to come in and compete for the starting nickel corner job. I talked about it a little after he was drafted, that even though he was listed as a safety, he took 434 out of his 630 total snaps in 2023 at slot corner. So, as I've done with these other dives, I took a look at Pro Football Focus and his game by game grades, and I watched his top graded game, his lowest graded game, and then I chose another game in between according to the grades given by PFF to decipher what the differences were in his best and his worst, and then try to gauge what he's going to do for the Buccaneers. So, Tykee Smith's best game was against South Carolina, where he got a grade of 84.4. His worst game was against Auburn with a 54.4. And then I also watched his game against Florida State in the Orange Bowl, which was at, I believe, I apologize, I forgot to write it down. It was around like a 71.5. It was kind of right there in the middle of his overall grades. But I wanted to see how he did in the Orange Bowl against the Florida State Seminoles. So let's start with his highest graded game and some of the biggest takeaways that I had from that. And I can absolutely see why this was his highest graded game. And I'll get to it, but for the first time in this exercise, I can see why Auburn was his lowest graded game. But let's start with the good that I saw out of Tykee Smith. He did have a huge pass breakup on third down late in the first quarter. He was consistently tested on go routes where he stayed step for step with the wide receivers and did not allow any big gains. He didn't allow any receptions on any of those go routes. And he was really quick. This was one of the earliest things that popped out to me watching this game against South Carolina. He is really, really quick to close on swing passes, screen passes, and short underneath throws, keeping gains at zero or at the very least, really, really minimal. And the big one in this game was his interception with under a minute to play to seal the win for Georgia. It was an absolutely phenomenal break on the ball. I cannot remember the wide receiver's name. I apologize. It wasn't Leggett. I believe his last name was Little. It started with an L. But you could see him post up and get ready for this pass from Spencer Rattler, and he thought he was wide open. It was a perfectly timed break to undercut the wide receiver by Tykee Smith. It probably looked like Tykee Smith just teleported directly in front of his face, stole that football, sealed the game for the Georgia Bulldogs. As for the good things that I saw against Auburn, the very first play that Auburn had after Georgia had thrown an interception and you saw a big momentum swing, Smith came off the edge and got a sack for a loss of 5 yards. And then on the next play after that, he reads the run perfectly and sheds the block from the slot receiver, makes the tackle to keep the gain at 3. Otherwise, given the blocking that was out there in front of the running back and all the open space, that probably would have gone far beyond just picking up the first down on 2nd and 15. It was a fantastic heads-up play by Tykee Smith in that situation. But let's flip things over to the bad, and I'll go back to the South Carolina game. There was one play where he came in on a blitz, and he got to Spencer Rattler, but he couldn't finish. Shades of Joe Tryon-Shoyinka, as we have seen so many times over the course of the last couple of years. He got the pressure, got his hands to him, couldn't finish the play. That ends up resulting in a 13-yard gain on the scramble by Spencer Rattler. He has to be more of a sure tackler in those situations. But that was really the only negative that stuck out from that game. Against Auburn, there were quite a few. Early in the game, he took a really, really bad angle in the backfield where he basically had the running back dead to rights for a tackle for loss, and instead it ended up being a 12-yard gain. Later on in the game, kind of a similar situation, but this time his tackle basically just gets broken in the backfield on 2nd and 5, results in a 4-yard gain. He did have some help behind him coming in, so that still set up a 3rd and 1, but it should have been more like a 3rd and 7 or 8. Then a defensive pass interference call in the second half with the game still tight. Pass interferences obviously are never good, but this one seemed to be intentional. Even the commentators were talking about it. He was beat. He was flat out beat on a really, really nice double move. And had he not pulled on the opposing receiver's jersey and gotten that pass interference penalty, that's going to be a touchdown instead of just a 15-yard penalty. So you don't like to see pass interference calls. You don't like to see your corners pulling on the jerseys or giving the opposing offense free yards. But that's one of those situations, kind of like an offensive lineman gets a holding penalty in order for his quarterback not to get killed. That in that situation with the game still tight, Tykee Smith just said, I'm not giving up this touchdown. I'll give up the 15 yards and we'll just go from there. As for the Florida State game, I realize I haven't mentioned that one yet. There wasn't really a lot to note. That game, and I apologize to those of you listening that are Seminole fans, that was an absolute massacre. And Tykee Smith ended up getting pulled early in the second half with the rest of the starters because the score, I believe, at that point was like 52-3. It was an absolute just shellacking. But one thing that did jump out to me that I didn't see in the other games, and I felt it was worth mentioning, was when one of his teammates got an interception on the last play of the first half. Smith immediately turned to become the lead blocker and trying to clear a path for his teammate to return that interception for a touchdown. And he was out there looking for people to lay into. They didn't score, but the awareness there was absolutely fantastic to see. And I think so many times, whether it's college or the NFL, we see the ball get taken away by a defender and the rest of the defense doesn't really do much. They kind of start celebrating early while the play is still happening. So the kind of mentality and awareness that Smith showed in that moment is what's going to lead to bigger plays for the Buccaneers defense down the road. Overall, I really, really liked what I saw when I was able to really hone in on Tykee Smith and focus on him and him alone and what he was doing play by play. But what is he going to bring to the Buccaneers next season? I'm going to talk about that coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs. Wrapping things up here on a Wednesday episode of Locked On Bucs. And I think when we look at Tykee Smith and his role and potential impact as a rookie, it is not lip service when I sit here and tell you he will absolutely compete for that starting nickel corner job. And I think he's likely going to win that job out before the midpoint of the season. He might even win it in camp and be the starter week one, but this kid can absolutely ball. He is incredibly intelligent and knows where he is supposed to be at any given moment. The thing that's going to hold him back a little is the run defense. It's really strange, too, when you're sitting here watching Georgia games and you're focusing on Tykee Smith. When he has the opportunity to make a play behind the line of scrimmage, he seems to struggle a little bit. If he's one-on-one in open space, whether it's a tight end, a wide receiver, a running back, a scrambling quarterback, no problem. The tackle is going to be made, which is really nice to see. But when he has opportunities to make splash plays in the backfield, it was so hit and miss throughout these games. That's something, especially in Todd Bowles' defense, that has to improve. Bowles loves sending his corners and safeties on blitzes, but he isn't going to do it if he doesn't trust the player to make the play. Instead, it's going to be Antoine, it's going to be Izien, it's going to be McCollum getting that call. That has to be addressed and cleaned up before the season begins. But he can absolutely make that improvement. He is athletic enough and smart enough and a good enough football player to improve that aspect of his game. But what jumped out to me the most was his quickness. He can close on a receiver so fast. In a play that looks like it could go for a first down, instead, he keeps it to like a 2 to 3 yard gain, setting up a second or a third and long, or a second and a third and medium. His fluidity, his decisiveness, his understanding are all extremely apparent when you watch him play football. And I really like Christian Izien. I was really impressed by him last year, an undrafted rookie out of Rutgers, stepping in and playing the way that he did. And I think the addition of Tavierre Thomas was a really, really smart one for the Buccaneers to make. But Tykee Smith is more of a pure athlete than either one of them. And ultimately, I think that's what is going to win him the job. Some of you may have seen it. Some of you may not, but friend of mine, JC Cornell, you guys, I'm sure most of you know who he is, founded the Draft Network, does a lot of stuff with the Loose Cannons guys. But after the draft, he basically put up the projected starting lineup for the Bucs on both sides of the ball on Twitter, the way he saw it. And Christian Izien took offense when JC had posted that Tykee Smith was going to be the starting nickel corner. And Izien is not going to lay down and let Smith walk in and take this job away from him after he earned that starting job as an undrafted rookie. And that's exactly what you want. That competition is going to make both of those players work harder, fight harder, and be smarter. And both of them are going to end up being better football players as a result of that competition. Then you throw Thomas into the mix, and it's going to be an all-out war in training camp for this job. I've talked about the battle for wide receiver 3. There's going to be the battle for running back 2 behind Rachaad White. This battle for the slot corner job is a 3-man race, and there is not a single one of these guys that is going to give an inch to the other ones. And that ultimately is what is going to make this secondary much better than it was last year, is the sheer competitiveness of these guys trying to earn a job. And on top of that, talked earlier about Jamel Dean not playing a full season at any point in his career so far. It's also going to make the depth of this secondary that much better. Yeah, I think Tykee Smith is going to contribute on special teams in some capacity, but from what I watched, I find it hard to believe that he won't be your starting slot corner by the time we get to the bye week. This kid has some of the traits that you want in your slot corner, and you can very clearly see that he is a Todd Bowles kind of player. So, of course, the next player up is going to be Jalen McMillan, and then after that, it's going to be Bucky Irving, going back to some of those other battles that I referenced. But what Tykee Smith is going to bring to this Buccaneers secondary is not only having won a championship at Georgia, but it's going to be the level of fire and passion that he has for the game, his level of play, and again, it's hard to tell a lot of times these guys' football IQ, but watching Tykee Smith, you can tell he knows exactly where he's supposed to be. And more often than not, he knows where the ball is going to be going. He is able to read offenses at an extremely high level and is really going to be able to utilize that in this competition with Christian Izien and Tavierre Thomas to try to get an edge on that starting job. The problem that he's going to have, although he is incredibly intelligent, although he can read offenses really, really well, is he's never had to read NFL offenses before. And it's going to be a little bit different than what he was dealing with against South Carolina or Florida State or Auburn, especially against Auburn. They ran a lot of the read option offense for much of that game. And he didn't have quite the opportunities in the pass game that he had against South Carolina, or for that matter, against Florida State. But of course, Florida State, you go back to that bowl game, and a lot of their best players that led them to an undefeated record didn't play in that bowl game. Their quarterback was out with the injury. A lot of the players said, you know what, we're just not going to risk our draft stock to play in this game when we should have been in the college football playoff. But Tykee Smith he's one of those guys that jumps off the screen because of always being in the right place at the right time. Now it's a matter of you're in the right place at the right time. You got to make sure that you finish the play, especially when we're talking about in the run game, when you have an opportunity to take down a running back for a loss, or in the passing game, when you're the guy that gets called on to be sent on blitzes. And there was a moment in the Auburn game where he was sent on all 3 downs in a row, first, second, third down in a row. He was blitzing every single time. So obviously he was trusted to get that job done at Georgia, but it still lacked a little bit in terms of his ability to close. So, the more I watched him, the more I really started to appreciate the pick, the more I really started to like the pick. And when you have Tykee Smith and Christian Izien and Tavierre Thomas all battling for this job, having to go up against Chris Godwin every single day, once again, I used the phrase the other day, it's really going to separate the wheat from the chaff, and we are going to see, to use another cliche, we're going to see the cream rise to the top, because you would be hard-pressed to go up against another slot wide receiver in the NFL better than Chris Godwin. So Tykee Smith, it's going to be some baptism by fire for him. Christian Izien, he's a little more used to it. He's got to play against Chris Godwin in practice going back to last year. Tavierre Thomas, he's going to have to get used to that too. So you really have a little bit of an edge for Christian Izien because of his familiarity already with the defense and his familiarity with Chris Godwin and going up against him. But this is going to be probably the number one position battle in Buccaneers training camp, is going to be this 3-way race for the nickel corner job. Like I said, we're going to have Jalen McMillan and Bucky Irving deep dives coming up next on the docket. Coming up tomorrow, plenty more to talk about in regards to what Todd Bowles had to say after practice. That's going to do it for this episode. Please check out everything going on over at BucsNation.com. Make sure you are following on Twitter at Locked On Bucs, at @JYarcho_Bucs. Become a Locked On Bucs insider. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs and make sure you are subscribed on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Hope you all have an absolutely outstanding day. Stay safe, stay healthy, fire the cannons. I want to thank you so much for joining me right here on Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.